All right. Good morning and welcome to the National Press Club. Our formal program will begin in 1 minute, but before we get started, I wanted to quickly review some housekeeping items. This event is being streamed live, so now would be an excellent time to silence your cell phones. You'll also find cards on your chairs. If you have any questions for our speakers today, please write them on the cards and pass them to the staff members, collecting them around the room. We love your questions, so don't be shy. I'll ask as many questions as time permits, but can't ask what I can't read, so please print legibly. I know it's a little hard to read, you'll see the letter later, but you know, penmanship makes a big difference. Thanks again, we'll get started in about a minute. All right, please come on, okay, get you settled. All right, good morning again. Welcome to the National Press Club, the place where news happens. I'm Jen Judson, former president and current Headliners team leader at the Press Club and the land warfare reporter at Defense News. This is truly a rare moment in historical discovery, the unveiling of a newly found letter written by George Mason with a reply from none other than George Washington. At a time when we often think we know all there is to know about the Founding Fathers, this remarkable document reminds us just how much the past still holds in reserve. The letter, dated April 6, 1768, was uncovered at Gunston Hall, Mason's Virginia home, by a graduate student whose diligence and curiosity led to this extraordinary find. Even more astonishing is this letter contains a direct reply from Washington, written in his own hand in 1789, more than 20 years later, and at a profoundly different moment in both men's lives and in the life of the new nation. Together, these two pieces of correspondence open a fresh window into the private dealings and quiet tensions between two of the Revolution's most influential figures. We often remember George Mason as a brilliant, if sometime reluctant, architect of liberty, the author of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, and the most principled opponent of the Constitution as originally drafted. And of course, George Washington is the indispensable man of the American founding, soldier, statesman, and ultimately president. Their eventual public break over the lack of a Bill of Rights has long shaped how we view their relationship, but this letter adds unexpected texture to the story. The content of Mason's 1768 letter focuses on a boundary dispute, a personal and technical issue involving land surveys, colonial patents, and competing claims that stretched as far back as the 1670s. It's a reminder that before they were founding legends, Mason and Washington were neighbors, Virginia planters and landowners, whose interests and identities forged in the day-to-day business of managing estates and asserting rights. And even in matters like this, subtle political and personal currents were often at play. The letter gives us a more intimate view of Mason's and Washington's divergence, one shaped not only by ideology, but by temperament, experience, and private disagreement. We're fortunate today to be joined by the very person who brought this document to light, Nick Gentry, graduate student at the University of Maryland and Digital Archives Fellow at Gunston Hall, discovered the letter. Alongside him is Dr. Kate Steir, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Senior Curator and Head of Collections at Gunston Hall, who has worked to contextualize and verify the letter and its significance. Please join me in welcoming them both as we explore what this discovery means for our understanding of Mason, Washington, and often complicated human relationships that shaped the founding of our country. Thank you so much for joining us today. So I'm going to kick off and I know we all really want to know, Nick, can you walk us through the moment where you found the letter? What were you looking for? What tipped you off that this was maybe something unusual or never before seen?
Yeah, so as my work is a Digital Archives Fellow, part of my job was to digitize the George Mason papers, which are held at Gunston Hall. And so I was going through and creating transcriptions for those papers because a lot of people these days can't read cursive, especially 18th century cursive. And so trying to make that legible. And you know, with Founding Fathers, a lot of their material has already been transcribed. So I was working off of transcriptions that already existed. And I figured, you know, a George Washington letter certainly would have been transcribed. And I, you know, looked it up to try to find it, and I couldn't find a transcription of it. I looked on various sites like Founders Online, which tend to have, you know, a huge repository of digitized and transcribed documents written by the founders, and it wasn't in there. I checked in the documentary editions of the Papers of George Washington and the Papers of George Mason. and it wasn't in there. And I was just sort of, with every additional source I checked, sort of becoming more and more surprised and more like, wait, this might actually be something that really hasn't been seen before by a lot of people. So it wasn't, when I came across the letter, I didn't realize initially that it was something unusual. I figured that someone before me had taken a look at it. And published it in a very public way, as most of the George Washington papers have. But as I looked more into it, I found that that wasn't the case, and it became really exciting.
Right. And Dr. Steir, do you have anything to add on the initial kind of discovery? Like, where is this letter? How come it's not been around? How come we haven't seen it?
Yeah, thank you so much. And this letter, I want to be completely accurate. There is one published transcription of it, and so I want to say thank you to Dr. Gerald Gewalt, who transcribed and self-published the letter in his The Power of Principle. You can check it out on Amazon. And that kind of tells this longer story of the way that these documents enter and leave public consciousness, because there have been, really since the revolution, these efforts by the Washington family in some cases, by archivists, by politicians, to shape these repositories of primary sources and think about the legacies and the information we have available about these founders. And now as we come into the sort of post-20th century digital landscape, there's, I think, a real democratization to that. When the letter came into the Gunston Hall collection, that was in the 1990s. And so there really wasn't digital publishing of primary sources in the way there is now. The sort of beautifully annotated hard copy George Washington papers had kind of finished their publication of this series. There was really nowhere to put it out except to have researchers come in person, which Dr. Gewalt did and was able to publish in hard copy. And we're so thankful for that. And also, there's still these limitations on being able to physically access and purchase a copy of this book.
Sure.
And so now we're able to build on that work. Nick has created a beautiful digital Omeka site that allows people to look at the original document that'll help protect it for the long term. And we're going to be able to share it with the George Washington Papers digital edition. And so they'll be able to do their incredible annotated research, and we'll be able to put it in conversation with all of these other sources that Nick was referring to, so that scholars can continue to make new use of it.
Okay.
It's very exciting.
So it slipped under the radar with the first publication of it. Where exactly was the letter found at Gunston Hall? How was it stored or filed? Had it been miscatalogued, overlooked, simply not recognized for its significance? Where'd you find it?
So it hadn't been miscatalogued. It was in our George Mason papers, but Gunston Hall is a smaller institution, and so I guess it had just been sort of overlooked, and like Kate said, sort of with the timing of it coming in the 90s, sort of in between these time periods of publishing the papers of George Washington. It existed in a finding aid that was accessible, if you came to Gunston Hall. But again, the sort of limitations of, scheduling an appointment and coming to, the archives in Lorton, Virginia, maybe sort of held it from being more recognized. So it was sort of where it should be.
Yeah, okay. What were your first thoughts when you realized George Washington's handwriting was on the document, and how did you confirm its authenticity? How do you work to confirm those things? You can both anscer that.
Yeah,
I know
I'll let Kate handle the authenticity question,
Okay. Yes.
and I'll
Kate,
handle
we'll let
the
you
first
take it.
part of the question. It was really exciting to be able, it's always cool to be able to hold and touch a piece of history like that, and so it was already exciting to be able to, be sort of hands-on in a very safe, archivally friendly sense with a document that old, and one that had George Washington's handwriting on it, and it was even more special to, realize that, I was sort of rediscovering this.
Excellent. All right, and Kate, I'll let you take how do you work through confirming authenticity.
Absolutely, and I am lucky that Gunston Hall has been a museum since the 1950s, and so we have this nice long tradition of documentation and professional research. In this case, also, we have a lot of examples in our collection of George Mason and George Washington's handwriting, which is deeply helpful. And because this letter in this dispute was sort of not a one-time thing, it's referred to in other letters. So as we were going through, the general outlines of the contents show up in these places that we expected to find the full transcription of the letter. Founders Online knows there was a land dispute, and people say, there were later letters where one of the Georges would say, per my letter of April 9th. So there's some sense that this is out there, but the actual transcription and piece was not included in any of these. So the combination of that was a really great hint. And finally, I was able to do provenance research. So we had a record that one of our wonderful regents at Gunston Hall had purchased this from Sotheby's, and I was able to track down the Sotheby's catalog and also confirm with their research. So it really was a group effort of many people who I've not gotten to meet in person, but that's sort of how scholarship works, and I love that.
Absolutely. Let's dive into the contents of the letter. It is over a land dispute. I had a chance to peek at the letter before getting up here on stage with you. It's quite long. So give me the Cliff's Notes. What was going on in the letter? What was George Mason writing to George Washington about? And talk a little bit about George Washington's reply as well, which is a much smaller paragraph at the bottom.
Yeah.
So there are sort of three components to the letter. The first and biggest portion is the land dispute. As you sort of mentioned, long before they were sort of known as like founding fathers, George Mason and George Washington were neighbors. Their plantations were very close to each other right along the Potomac River. And at that time, land was really equivalent to power and wealth. That is how these people essentially made their fortune, was through this landowning that they then had as plantation land. And so these disputes are very common in the letters of George Mason and these founding fathers. You'll see, like on the Omeka site where we have a lot more letters digitized, you'll see this sort of thing come up a lot because this was so important. And then there are also some sort of fun personal tidbits, which again show you sort of how close of a relationship these people had, at times tense, as you sort of mentioned, but that they really sort of knew each other. George Mason is sort of discussing potential school teachers for George Washington that he might hire for his stepchildren. And then also he's complaining about a tenant who was apparently, he's referred to as a rascal who does rogues tricks in the letter. So a very old-fashioned way of talking about this person, Gates, but it seems like they didn't have very nice things to say.
Okay. Amazing. Do you have a favorite part of the letter that kind of stands out to you?
Yeah, I think my favorite part is in the discussion of the school teachers. First of all, because at one point, George Mason refers to, well, I'll check the character of this school teacher with my current school teacher, McPherson, who's an indentured servant. So there's something really interesting to me there about understanding kind of the social role that these school teachers played. And then George Mason also sort of adds, if you hire this other school teacher that they were talking about, a Mr. Campbell, he's a very good Latin scholar, but he doesn't keep his house so well. So maybe don't have the young Mr. Custis live with him. And that is, first of all, just so funny to me, but it also helps me to think a little bit about childhood and education and the way that not only were these children going to these schoolmasters to learn about Latin and mathematics and grammar, but also to learn about sort of lifestyle. And it was their introduction to a wider world. And I hadn't really thought about it that way before.
Yeah, that's amazing. I did want to ask, when you discover letters like this, has this discovery prompted, re-examination of other materials in the Gunston Hall collection? Since you did discover this letter that hadn't been noticed or went under the radar, is it possible that there are more overlooked gems in the collection that you're still going through?
We actually very recently.
Well, I guess you're going to have to come back to the club.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, mark us down on the schedule again. We found in a much less in position where it should be, just in the lid of an archival box, we found another very short Washington letter that was, again, not digitized or published online. That was referring to, it was basically a letter of recommendation for a cook that cooked that Washington employed while he was at the, it wouldn't have been the White House then, because this was before the White House was built, but where he lived during his presidency. And so, yeah, that was just sort of in an archival lid. So there's, who knows how much more is in there.
All right, well, excellent. Well, keep up the good work finding these things. So the letter concerns a boundary dispute, something that might seem mundane at first glance, but why is this kind of topic so revealing about the relationship among the founders? Yeah. Kate, if you want to take that, or Nick, whatever, whoever wants to go first on that one. Okay. You looked excited.
Yeah, well, I think Nick did a really great job earlier of kind of summarizing the importance of land. Of course, George Washington also was a surveyor. So there is this way that was important to his professional identity, also his kind of understanding and relationships with a number of landholders throughout the Virginia area. And also the way that George Mason talks about resolving land disputes, it's a matter of principle. There's a way in there he talks about, well, if we're both men of principle, we can't help but settle this amicably. And it's really interesting then to see that by the time George Washington really sees this as closed out, I don't know if they would have described each other probably still as men of principle, but their principles had come into conflict in these interesting ways. So that I found really, really fascinating. Also, one of the beauties of making these things so accessible via digitization is scholars with different expertise can come in. And so we've had the opportunity recently of working with George Mason University that has a digital history program. And so a wonderful scholar, Dr. Greta Swain, has come in and done like georectification of all of these old maps. And so I think there's really an opportunity for people who understand, who are geographers, to be able to think about the landscapes in really different ways.
Okay. That's super fascinating, especially, personalities are kind of coming out. George Mason is like, we need to do this, it's a matter of policy and principle, and it took George Washington 20 years to respond. So can you talk a little bit about why, you may think that it took him 20 years? I mean, obviously surveys take time, but just curious, what your thoughts are, what you might theorize as to why it took him that long to respond. Maybe they had other conversations in between, but maybe not.
So it's not exactly like a response 20 years later. They were in active discussion about this sort of thing at the time. What Washington did, and what a lot of men like Washington did at this time, is they kept very good records, which is very useful for us. And so Washington actually went through and wrote notes on basically all of these letters that he received that were in his collection, filing them away into certain places and writing notes about this letter has been, this was resolved in this way at this time. And so that's really what the sort of portion is at the end, is him sort of noting to himself for his record keeping.
So this is not something that was returned to George Mason. It was his way of saying, all right, this letter is closed out and put in my file.
Exactly.
Okay, very interesting. Do you have any evidence that this exchange was continued in person or in other letters? Like what, you said that you think that they may have continued the conversation, but just kind of curious what your thoughts are on the extent of the conversations they may have had over this in between.
Yeah. So one thing is, in that kind of closeout note, George Washington mentions there was a survey conducted in the presence of George Mason. And this is one of those things where thinking about the way in which information transferred is something I think about all the time, because you know, there are cases where we know George Mason and George Washington sat together and wrote the Fairfax Resolves and then rode to Alexandria and published them. But there are so many times where we kind of get to wonder, they weren't that far physically apart. They're very close neighbors, but George Mason, Gunston Hall was 5,000 acres of land. So a next door neighbor in that context is quite different than the way I think about my next door neighbors. Yeah. And so that's also, I think, really important to understanding. And then we can kind of only get these glimpses through these notes, like we had a survey, we were both present, of what are all the things we can't see through letters.
Okay. So this letter kind of seems to reveal subtle tensions beneath the surface. I mean, they were friends, but they were, you know, experiencing disagreement, major disagreement over the Constitution. That's something familiar in modern politics, I think. Do you see parallels with today's political or ideological splits among allies that, you know, kind of remind you of what was going on with George Mason and George Washington? Anything that kind of fits into modern day? If you could compare them. Hard to. That's a tough one.
Yeah, because I mean, George Mason, excuse me, died in 1792, and so just thinking about, you know, the way he envisioned democracy, he was worried because he thought that most, you know, representatives should know their constituents. He had no way of envisioning a world in which there were so many people participating in democracy, in which the United States would be so huge. But one of the things that I do think really is interesting about the founders is there are these incredible exchanges of ideas, and there are these ways in which so many of them presented different perspectives and felt very strongly about their different perspectives. And I think that's also where you see, for example, George Mason's commitment to freedom of the press, to this free exchange of ideas. He called it the bulwark of liberty. And so I think that commitment to disagreements, sometimes public, often private, was an important part of how they thought about political exchange.
Okay. We do have a quote here that Mason wrote that was that freedom of the press is one of the great bulwarks of liberty and can never be restrained by despotic governments. I would love to hear your thoughts on, you know, what was Mason potentially really going through or thinking about when he wrote this? What was happening at the time that, you know, caused him to be compelled to write something like this? And how should we think about it in modern terms now that we see what is happening in today's world, in particular in the last several months? What is happening with the freedom of the press?
Yeah. So George Mason was responding to a climate in which he was living under colonial rule. He was a subject of the British Empire, and where there was incredibly strict danger for criticizing the king in particular. There were libel laws that could lead criticism of the crown to really being a politically dangerous act. And so he was thinking of the importance of those free exchange of ideas and thinking also particularly about newspapers and publication in that sense. So when I, again, thinking, you know, he passed away in 1792, his idea of what the press and the media environment was so incredibly different than anything that we would have today. And this is also, you know, he was very specific thinking about the press. Other founders, you know, had different ideas about expression and what encompasses all of that. And so it's, you know, there's no idea of knowing what George Mason would think about anything that developed after 1792.
I would love to know, yeah. So this letter does reveal, I think, subtle tensions beneath the surface of this public alliance that George Washington and George Mason had. Can you point to maybe an example or two where you feel like you're sensing tension between the two of them in this letter, or do you not see that at all? Just kind of curious if you saw like any hinges of their relationship and where it stood at the time the letter was written.
Well, I think as Kate was sort of mentioning, George Mason was very had very certain like principles in how he considered like business dealings should go. Again, if you go on the Omeka site and you're looking through the letters, there are a lot of letters where he is writing to people about maybe seemingly minor differences in
very
accounting.
principle-oriented.
Yes, especially when it came to his money and his land. And so, you know, I think for George Mason, having these disputes resolved was absolutely top priority. You know, they were neighbors and, you know, knew each other very well, but at this time, they were also, you know, planters and landowners, and those interests often sort of came first.
Okay, yeah, very interesting. Anything to add to that? Or?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I always think about in their relationship also is that George Mason was a little bit older than George Washington. So I think there are ways in which he has this kind of generational prerogative sometimes in their dealings of like, this is sort of a more junior member of the community. I also, in the letter, there's this sort of interesting discussion where he's talking about like, yeah, I knew these patents were bad, but I didn't see it as it had nothing to do with me, so I didn't look into it. But you know, you want to resolve this, we'll resolve this. And so I think he's very principle-oriented, not wanting to compromise on very many things, and also very sort of specific about what are the things that matter and what are the things that are not his problem.
That's really interesting because obviously George Mason refused to sign the Constitution over his issue of it not containing a Bill of Rights. So, has this letter sparked any new research or rethinking in the academic community about Mason or Washington or the broader founding generation? I know you said that you had a lot of academics come and take a look at the letter and you know, look at it through their lens. So just kind of curious how that's evolving.
So part of this is, part of what we're doing here is getting the word out that this is available to have scholars come. Yeah, and so I'm very excited to see what use they are going to make of it. For my academic interests within Gunston Hall, I'm really interested in learning more about these tenants and thinking about, you know, these large landholders existing within these broader Virginia and Chesapeake communities and how they interacted with, you know, middle-class folks. So I think that's an area certainly of growth, but part of the beauty of being an archivist is, you know, we hold the documents and we let these scholars come and they're the experts and they see things that we could never think of.
Yeah, very interesting. Nick, anything to add to that?
And I was just going to say, Kate's mentioned this before, but I think that's what's really exciting about putting it online and having a transcription available for the first time is a lot of times it can be difficult for someone to, you know, travel to Lorton to go, but now it's a lot more accessible, a lot more people can look at it, and, you know, they can give their various views on it. And like Kate said, you know, find things in it that I wouldn't be able to.
Yeah, can you elaborate on, you know, why does digitization and publication of these documents matter? And you're starting to get there, but yeah, I would love a little more elaboration on that.
Yeah, so the thing about archives is that it's not really in this like you know, a library book or a book in general where you can just sort of buy it on Amazon. Various different institutions have various different ways of cataloging what they have. There are various attempts by you know, certain groups like Archives Grid or SNAC to sort of combine these databases into like a sort of centralized database, but none of them are comprehensive, and so it can be difficult for people to find documents in archives, and then even more difficult to, you know, if you're a researcher at, you know, who's in California, you know, are you really going to make the trip all the way to Virginia just to like look at this one document?
Yeah.
You know, that can be difficult financially and practically. So putting it online and then getting the word out through things like this makes it a lot more accessible. It means a lot more researchers can view it I know me personally in the research I've done, I never would have been able to do that if there wasn't so much that had been digitized already. And so that can be really helpful to researchers and get a much wider range of perspectives.
Absolutely. Just seeing this, it's paper. It's not going to last forever. So it's kind of a way of obviously protecting things for the future. What, and maybe you have a little bit more of a sense of this, but you said that 1950s, I believe, is when you began establishing a legitimate collection at Gunston Hall. How were documents and things like this kept? I mean, I know that at certain periods of time in our country, we weren't as great handling historical documents or preserving things, and now, we're very careful. But just kind of curious, what you've heard or researched in terms of how documents have been kept. Obviously we still have them, thankfully, but I would imagine there's probably not been as much of a meticulous care of many of the documents that, say, our founding fathers had. So just curious on your thoughts on that, and if you do.
Sure. So actually, George Mason's papers in particular are interesting to talk about in this way because at Gunston Hall we have a very small, relatively speaking, collection of George Mason's papers because most of his papers actually burned in a fire. And so fires were much more common back then,
right.
And that sort of thing happened a lot. You also have documents just sort of being kept in private collections where they're subject to water damage, any number of things. But even when they're in an institution, sometimes if you have developing ideas of how to preserve things and maybe sort of inconsistency in the staff that you have, and you don't always have someone who's aware of these papers or able to protect them. I can tell you that the other Washington letter we found was
stuck to a lid.
Yes, and it was pasted onto a sheet of notebook paper with glue. So this one is luckily in pretty good condition, especially for a letter of its time, but that's certainly something you have to think about.
And you'll notice it is in a dark area as well.
Yes, thank you to the Press
Yes,
Club
thank you.
for taking such good care of our heritage.
Yes, absolutely. Anything to add on that?
Yeah, I feel like there are kind of two questions here, right? One is the preservation of the documents, and tied to that, but a little bit distinctly, is kind of the organization and the memory keeping of them. And this is, as Nick was saying, a case where, for example, the Washington, or really the Custis descendants, because George Washington, did not have biological children with Martha, so the people who kept his legacy alive in that sense were really the Custis children. We're very careful about kind of collecting documents, making sure that they were kept together. George Mason had 9 children that survived to adulthood. He was very kind of specific, actually, about not everything going to the oldest son. And then there were the fires. So his legacy is split in this really interesting way. And beyond that, also, he really didn't think of himself as a public person in the same way that George Washington did. He published almost nothing under his name. So he had one son who was really interested in the legacy. The other children seemed to have been content to allow him to kind of go into the private memory of the family. And so there are these streams and interests of different family members trying to collect documents, but it isn't that same kind of comprehensive thing that you see in the Washington Custis family. So that's kind of one area. And then tied to that, we're so lucky to be able to have our physical collections at Gunston Hall. And I see it as my legal and ethical obligation to keep those documents in the best possible condition for perpetuity, forever, because we hold them in trust for the public, for you all. And part of doing that is it's also no good if no one can come and read them. Right. So this digitization lets us do both. It lets us keep that in a document in a beautiful, climate-controlled, dark room, and then anyone can come and take a look at the digitized version and have, in addition to the transcript, maybe someone is going to notice something about the changes in penmanship. Maybe they're going to notice something about the quality of the paper. And we're able to do that now because of this digitization and build on the transcription work and other things that have come before.
Okay, excellent. I'm just going to ask a few questions that came in from the audience. Can you speak a little more to the provenance research of the letter? Was it before, where was it before it was at Sotheby's?
Yeah. So it came to Sotheby's in the 1990s. It was in a private collection, the details of which are not totally public.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Family or something.
Exactly.
And for Nick, beyond these two letters that flew under the radar, do you have a favorite Mason-Washington exchange? You've been reading a lot of these. So.
I'm not sure if I have. I'm going to slightly dodge the question by going to my favorant Mason letter.
Okay.
Not necessarily to Washington, but close enough.
You've been reading a lot more.
I have been reading a lot of Mason letters. I am really interested. I'm really interested in sort of the mundanity of the lives of these people that we sort of lift up to pedestals. On such a pedestal, and so we have a letter in the collection that's George Mason talking about how to properly seal a basement to prevent from cockroach infestations.
I would like to know that.
Yeah, I don't know if the 18th century methods work as well today, but maybe they were onto something. And so I think it's really interesting when, and this letter sort of speaks to that, but I think that one especially, you can sort of look into the private lives of these people who, again, are sort of, mythologized so much, and see like the very sort of mundane, day-to-day aspects of their life,
Real
including
human lives.
Yeah,
absolutely. What about you? Do you have a favorite?
So I do. There is another letter in our collection where it seems that a German coachman, who was an indentured servant, went to George Washington to ask for a job, and Washington wrote back. So we have Mason's reply basically saying, he has a bad attitude and he's kind of drunk, and I asked him to teach his replacement and he didn't do it. So you know what, at this point, if you want to employ him knowing all of that, I will let him go. And again, it's this kind of funny story. It gives, I think, a real sense of Mason's personality. He's not mincing words. But it also kind of puts the two of them and their relationship in context and populates, there's this whole world around these two people of individuals moving in and out and kind of living their own lives and possibly having these really important knock-on effects of the revolution. And this is kind of a chance to bring those stories of those people in as well.
That's cool. It kind of shows their friendship in a sense that, willing not to sugarcoat it for him, it's going to be totally honest.
Yeah, exactly.
How did George Mason view the new Constitution, Articles of Confederation, and Philadelphia Convention?
Yeah, so there's a lot of pieces of that.
That's a big question.
Yes, so George Mason did attend the Philadelphia Convention, which is a big deal for him because he hated traveling. And not only did he go, he stayed the whole time. He was, I think, the third most prominent speaker. So he had a lot of opinions, and then he ultimately not only refused to sign the Constitution, but said he would rather cut off his right hand than use it to sign the Constitution.
Also not sugarcoating there.
Exactly, he said what he meant. And so that was, a very kind of dramatic statement of his disapproval. Not signing because of the Bill of Rights is, the number one reason. He had a list of 17 reasons, which he did not wish to have published, but were published anyway. So that kind of got out ahead of him. However, by the time he died in the early 1790s, the Bill of Rights had passed, and he had seen the ways in which the Constitution was implemented. And so by the end of his life, he was able to say that the document as it existed at that time, he would have happily set his hand and heart to. So it is kind of a lovely ending to his political life.
Yeah, absolutely. Was there any indication of bringing the land dispute discussed in the letter to a court of law? Did it get to that point, or was it just survey and resolved?
So that's one of the things they discussed, that they really want to handle it internally, and that it's, again, kind of this matter of principle, that they are two trustworthy gentlemen, and if they have to go to a court of law, it's this sign that the trust is really broken.
What are some little-known facts about George Mason that you think deserve more public attention? We've talked a little bit about some of the windows into who he was, but what are some of the things that really go under the radar that tell us who George Mason was as a person and as a political figure?
So this is maybe not as relevant to his political career, but I'm just going to give my favorite George Mason fun fact, which is that he tried to domesticate virtually every animal on his property. He tried to tried to enclose deer and have them domesticated. Not super successful, exactly.
Trying to figure out what that enclosure looks like.
But it does also, I think, sort of speak in an interesting way to the way that he viewed his land as something that he had absolute control over.
He wanted a zoo.
Even to the extent of the deer who happened upon it. Yeah. So it's a fun fact, but also kind of an interesting look at the way that land was viewed back then.
Yeah, absolutely.
He tried to send his son in France live possums, right, as a present?
Live possums, a deer fetus, a lot of strange, of strange things.
Yeah. But I mean, I feel like everything about George Mason flies a little bit under the radar. He's really not as well known outside of Virginia and people who are deeply interested in the Revolution. And I think part of that is because even though the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which again, I think this is a point of information that deserves more attention, was the first kind of North American legally enforceable statement of individual rights. He drafted that. So much of that language ends up in the National Bill of Rights. But because of his principled stance, he refused to be involved when it became a national conversation. And so a lot of people who did not become so involved in the drafting or in the working out of what should and should not be included get a lot of the credit, whereas I think he is an important part of that story.
Okay. How does Gunston Hall plan to display or interpret this letter to the public? You said you'll have a digitized copy and then you'll have it in Gunston Hall. Will it be published anywhere else? Are you working to get it, new editions of some of the other publications that contain letters, added to those? Talk a little bit more about your plans for the letter.
Absolutely. So because of wanting to preserve it, it's not going to be on permanent display after this. We are going to have it at Gunston Hall this Saturday. It is the 459th anniversary of the ratification of the Virginia Declaration of Rights. So you can come in person to Gunston Hall all day, and myself and Evie Quigley, our collections tech, will be there with the letter, and you can talk to us more about it. And then also we will be sharing it with the Washington Papers digital editions out of University of Virginia, and they do not only incredible publications, but their footnoting, their research, their annotations are absolutely stunning. And so that's, again, another way where we have this published version in hard copy that Dr. Gwalt gave. Now it's going to be even more accessible digitally, and then there'll be this additional layer with these wonderful annotations. So the way we can really build on the scholarship.
Okay. And Nick, how has this discovery shaped your own view of historical research and your academic path? Do you think differently about archives now that you've found this?
I don't know if it's differently, but I think it really emphasized one of my favorite things about archives, which is just that it's never complete. I think it's tempting, especially for someone like George Washington, who's probably one of the most documented figures of all time. Yeah. You can read almost everything he wrote. There are a million biographies about him, practically. But there's still always more to discover. In archives, so much is unprocessed, so much, is just sitting there that people haven't really looked through. And so I think it's just something that's so exciting about history and about archives in particular is that, we could work for hundreds of years for the future, and we will still not have something complete.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to ask if you could ask Mason or Washington just one question about the exchange, knowing what we know and what we don't know. What would that question potentially be for Mason or Washington? Anything like kind of hanging out that's a gap for you?
I would want to know what they said in person. Mm-hmm. I want to know what's between the letters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I would like, for me, the most interesting part is about the tenant. I would like to know more about the tenant Gates. I think it's really interesting. Mm-hmm. Again, like Kate was sort of alluding to, that these sort of more middle, lower class people who are sort of existing in the orbit of these people, who obviously do not appear as much in the records. We don't have like a digitized version of all the papers of Gates. So I'd be more interested.
I don't know if rascals save their papers like it.
Right.
I am curious about that. So if you have a bad tenant, how did you handle it in the 1700s if you had a rascal living on your property? Do you have any documentation on how Mason or Washington handled the tenants that they may want to get rid of? Like, how did you do that?
Yeah, and Mason talks a little bit about this in the letter, which I thought was interesting, where he says that Gates is aware that at this point his continuation of his lease is based on good behavior, which I think was interesting because they did have these formal leases, and then it seems like there were these clauses and stipulations of, all right, and if any of your neighbors complain about you, this is null and void.
How do you translate into modern day language a rascal? And I forget the rest of how he was described, but how would you interpret that now in modern language? What does that mean?
Rogues tricks.
Yeah, rogues tricks, playing rogues tricks. I'd certainly say it's impolite.
Any thoughts on what that means?
Well,
in modern day?
I know, I'd be so curious. One of the things that Mason says is well, the neighbors have stopped complaining. So I feel like that's where the key for me would be, what is it are the neighbors complaining about? Yeah. And given the sort of rogues tricks, I'm wondering, is he not paying his rent on time? Is he taking from some of the other neighbors? It's speculation, but thinking about the ideas about property and the way that kind of keeping property through the rest of the letter, for Mason is a matter of principle. I don't know if a rogue's trick would do that.
Yeah. The issue of land property, competing claims resonates today as well, from housing policy to environmental concerns. What does this dispute sort of tell us about the priorities and legal frameworks of the time? I mean, obviously land was very important, but the needing to have these surveys and all of this seemed very important. So if you could talk a little bit more about that framework that they were existing in.
So I think one thing that's sort of mentioned a little bit in this letter and is also mentioned in some other Mason letters from around this time is that they're really working with they're existing in a very sort of new society, at least in the way that they're sort of setting it out. And so you often have references to older surveys that may be incorrect, or you have multiple people survey the same land and claim that land, and then how do you resolve that? And so I think one of the sort of situations that people at this time often found themselves in is before there is that when there's sort of a less robust legal system to sort of handle these sorts of disputes, and sort of, as Kate was saying, is often preferable to just gentleman's honor, this sort of thing. How do you determine whose land belongs to who?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and one thing I would add to that, so we've started doing a series we're calling History Bites, which is a digital live and then on YouTube and then the videos are available afterwards, where we bring in scholars who are looking at the legacy of some of these debates and ideas into the 19th and 20th centuries. And we had Dr. Andreas Myris, who does research on kind of labor history, and he was talking about in the 20th century legal disputes, because the idea of property in these early frameworks was real estate in various capacities and movable goods and furnishings. And then in the 20th century, people start having lawsuits about what if their property is in wages or in lost revenue or in shares of a corporation. And there was no sort of understanding of that in these original legal frameworks. So that's a case where bringing in different scholars is really, really important.
Okay. I wanted to kind of ask a fun question, then I'll ask a little bit more about the work you're doing. But if you could have dinner with either George Mason or George Washington, just one, who would you choose, and what's one question you would ask them? Also, what do you think they would order for dinner?
I feel like I would want to have dinner with George Mason. I feel like I know what to expect. I think he would be very honest, which I would enjoy. We know a little bit from food history. They had a lot of pork, like a lot of pork, and everything would probably be deep fried in butter.
My stomach hurts.
So, you know, that's a general sense of what I think they were probably eating. One question that I would ask him, I think it really depends on, you know, when in his life cycle we were getting the chance to talk, because he is like very firm in his principles, and yet just sort of so thoughtful that you know there would be all of these different kind of moments and debates going on. I think I would like to ask him about what he thought of the Declaration of Independence.
That was a really good one.
I mean, I feel like I sort of have to say, I'm obligated to say
biased?
George Mason,
Okay.
as, you know, it's Gunston Hall.
I get it,
you know.
I get it.
I feel like we're sort of the minority of people who would say George Mason in that circumstance.
I don't know, what you've described so far, it sounds like somebody.
Yeah. Yeah, like Kate said, I'm not sure I would want what they ordered for dinner, but I don't know. I might be interested to ask about, you know, the sort of expansion of the Bill of Rights as it sort of happened with, obviously, Mason has like an incredibly complicated legacy with slavery, where he, you know, he wrote a lot about it being like a sort of a great sin and like a stain sort of upon the landowning gentry class that he was a part of, but at the same time he never manumitted any of the people that he enslaved, and so that's sort of always been it's been a question sort of at the center of like most attempts to reckon with Mason's legacy. So I guess asking about that expansion of Bill of Rights would sort of cover that partially.
On your work, how much more is there to do to digitize what you have at Gunston Hall, all the work that you're doing? I know it's hard to predict necessarily, but you know, what's the stack of work ahead of you? And what's next for you after you get through all this?
So the George Mason papers, as I said, it's a pretty small collection because, again, most of them were burned in fire. So these are just sort of papers from various private collections that have sort of been compiled over time that, you know, this would have been in someone else's collection, not George Mason's collection. As far as, so this is pretty much it's not the entire George Mason papers, but it's most of the George Mason papers we have. As far as the entire archives, this is an incredibly small sliver of what we have, far more than I could really
You'd be
take
doing
on
that for the rest of your life,
in my time for quite a while. So, I mean, I would love to get the opportunity to help digitize more, but yeah, in terms of digitizing the John Mason papers, for example, the son that Kate was talking about, who wrote a lot about his father, that's a much larger collection.
Yeah, so there's still a lot that it's worth coming to Gunston Hall to see. And we're trying to make our collections as accessible as possible. So watch this space, but yeah, there's a lot to do.
Mm-hmm. What about, I mean, you talk about obtaining things from private collections. You know, how much do you think there are still in private? It's hard to estimate potentially, but like, you know, what are your thoughts about how much it still remains potentially in private collections that could come to the surface?
It's a great question. And I mean, there are, at the last count, I think something like 10,000 known Mason descendants, because, you know, 9 surviving children, very large family.
Wow.
So, you know, if anyone has any papers and they want to get in touch with us, there's simply no way to know. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think we're almost to our close, but before I ask the final question, let me take a moment to thank the Headliners team and the members who assisted with this event, as well as Club Executive Director Didier Saugy and the entire club staff for making this possible. Thank you to our audience for being here with us today, and we hope to see you at the next Headliners evening on Thursday, June 12th at 6 p.m., where historian Jeff Wasserstrom will discuss his new book, The Milk Tea Alliance and the Pro-Democracy Movement Across Asia. Now, let me present to you our esteemed National Press Club mug. Pass that over to you. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. And for our final question, I'd like to take historical figures and think about what they would be like in our time. So let's say George Mason, George Washington, and a few other founders had a group chat. Based on what you've read, who would be the most active? Who would be the one always lurking but never replying? And who would be the one just, you know, dropping links from The Onion or something like that?
I'm going to put a slight spin on it and say I think that George Mason, you know, if you went out and got lunch with George Mason, he would instantly send you a Venmo request.
That sounds like it.
Yeah, and he would take 20 minutes to divide the bill.
Yes.
Yeah. I think
You had this, and
Yeah.
Yeah, I think he would be the most active in the group chat. I think he'd be sending like paragraphs of every thought that he had, you know, at 2 in the morning or whatever. I just read a new book.
So George Washington would be the lurker.
I feel like he would have a pithy reply.
Okay.
Yeah.
20 years later. All right, well, thank you so much for taking the time to join us, and thank you, everybody in the audience, I hope you enjoyed it.